Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we have a very important Bitcoin conversation between Joe Carlasare and Natalie Brunell, which we are sure you'll find very interesting.
I want to ask you about Bitcoin self-custody. Do you think that there will be a battle for individuals to be able to custody their Bitcoin, and the government's going to want it to be kind of more regulated and controlled within certain entities, all KYC? I mean, how do you see that playing out?
So I, for one, think globally, there will almost be certainly countries that try to pass draconian rules and laws to prevent people from self-custodying Bitcoin. I think in my mental model, I expect it fully. In the United States in particular, I actually want it to happen for selfish reasons, because I personally think that once there is some sort of silly, dumb rule about self-custody where they're trying to ban me from keeping 12 words in my head, I can't wait to bring a constitutional challenge to that, because I don't believe that's constitutional. I think courts in particular will frown upon any sort of restrictions on people keeping information. And so I think that if it were to happen in the United States, ultimately it would be declared unconstitutional. I don't think it's constitutional to bar people from keeping 12 words in their head, which is what you're doing when you're saying, well, you can't have a non-custodial wallet. I think it's kind of a silly term overall. But I guess I wouldn't put it as terribly high on my list of things that I think about when I consider, regulation coming down the line. I think there are far more likely aspects of regulation that could be hostile. I think there's always going to be voices in the government that despise Bitcoin for the foreseeable future. But what I find increasingly encouraging is, look at the news over the last several months. You've got presidential candidates now speaking more favorably about Bitcoin. That is not something that I think you would see if you were facing very harsh regulation or legislation coming down the line. I don't see that at all. I don't know why people would read it otherwise. And I'll just say one final thing on that. There are judges, and I don't think this gets talked about enough. They're not going to be public about it, but there are judges and appellate court justices and folks I know in particular that hold Bitcoin. Okay, if there were legal challenges brought against Bitcoin holders, or some sort of challenge, that some sort of onerous regulation like that, those judges are going to hear those cases. And although they're supposed to follow just the law, we know that judges are human beings like anybody else, and they think about what do we really want to have as a society. So I guess I would conclude by saying I'm very optimistic that in the United States of America, eventually things are going to err on the side of liberty and freedom. And I think you've seen in particular with the court cases that have come down the last several years in particular, that judges are not hesitating to put down decisions that curtail legislative and executive overreach. And I think that's going to be true in Bitcoin as well.
I hope you're right. You're making me feel more optimistic, because I have had a lot of guests who view the world as one that is descending into more chaos and loss of freedoms. And I'm sure you call them doomers. Maybe that's the case. And I do worry about that if we got into a situation where the U.S. was under threat, not just maybe from a military standpoint, but really economically, their position as the global superpower, what lengths would they go to? And some people think maybe confiscation, but they didn't really go door to door, right? When 6102 for gold was enacted, they didn't actually confiscate everyone's gold. People turned it in. It would be very hard to do that with Bitcoin, especially when you could just memorize 12 words. But I just do wonder what is the worst case scenario, and how do people best protect themselves? Because there does seem to be more of an attack on privacy tools, on coin joins, things that, you're not using the Bitcoin for nefarious activities. You just don't want anyone to find out how much you have or what you're necessarily doing with it for just privacy reasons.
So, let's talk about a more sober assessment, right? If there were issues that I think the government's ready to go to the mat on and fight extremely hard, what you just mentioned is it, right? The issue of being able to trace, monitor, detect, those are issues I fully expect very tough cases to be filed in the years ahead. And what I've always said is if you're going to be engaging in those activities as a developer, as a business in the United States, you should be fully prepared for rigorous scrutiny from the United States government. Any efforts to obfuscate or obscure transactions and hide privacy, I fully expect cases. The government is just never going to bend on that for many reasons, one of which they will claim is national security, but also taxation, right? They want to be able to capture the money that they think is owed to the government. So I don't expect any even some of the more favorable friends of Bitcoin, right? They're not going to be seen as backing people trying to hide transactions. And don't get me wrong, like I believe in privacy. I think that the developers doing and making those tools, it's very valuable, right? But I'm just telling you from when I'm advising clients and talking about risk vectors, right? The issues related to what you just talked about, mixers and anonymizers, those are sort of issues you really got to be sensitive about. So I think you're exactly right here. But just to go back for a second, right? Our system is built in many ways to anticipate overreach by the government. That's why we have checks and balances, right? We know you could get a bad president in there that's going to reach too far and try to be a tyrant. That's why we have the court system. That's why we have the Congress, right? That's why there's the separation of powers in general. We know the same thing can happen with the Congress, right? You can have a Congress that passes unconstitutional laws. There are laws they have passed since the beginning of the country that courts have struck down, saying you're exceeding your enumerated powers under the Constitution. So that's kind of like the way the system is supposed to work. And for the people that will point to, well, the government did this during COVID, they reached too far, they suppressed your liberties. That kind of happens every time there's a crisis. The Japanese internment camps in this country where they hauled people in, they said, without any due process, we're just going to confine you because we think that there's a war going on. This is happening routinely through almost every decade. The beauty of the American system, though, is that although it can be painful to people in the short run, Americans always eventually do the right thing in the long run. And if you look at some of the things that have been put in place, even very controversial things like the mask mandates, right? Courts struck those down eventually. A lot of courts came in and said, you're exceeding the authority you have, and we're going to pull it back. That's kind of how the system works. So yeah, I do push back against the people that are negative, because I think in the long run, we're going to be able to put in place better rules, and the bad ones will be struck down.
But aren't there a lot of blurred lines when it comes to even like the spying agencies, the Patriot Act, what's been done? We think about Edward Snowden, and he still is very active online, sharing how much overreach is still happening and how much we're being essentially surveilled and monitored. So it's like, well, where are the courts there preventing something like that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, privacy is one of the pivotal fights of our time, right? Yeah. You're not going to get me to say it's not an issue. Like, I'm not going to come up here and tell anybody listening to this that, oh, don't worry, you're not being there's not mass surveillance. Don't worry that tech companies have such a power to censor and shut you down. I fully agree with all that, right? But the notion that these aren't problems we can solve is what I reject. Okay. If it takes new legislation to put in place people to have greater rights with respect to their data, greater rights with respect to online platforms and who can be turned off and who can be censored, let's get the legislation. Let's get leaders elected that can fix those issues. What I don't understand is why people have this view that these problems are somehow unsolvable.
Yeah, no, I understand. When it comes to privacy tools for Bitcoin, I think of something that Michael Saylor said that really resonated with me, and that's a reminder that Satoshi created Bitcoin. He created a way, and then he gave it away. And a lot of these developers, they create businesses essentially and extract profit from a lot of these privacy tools, whereas it really should be open source. It should be ethically given away. It truly decentralized, not influenced by anyone, no one profiting from it. And then maybe we could have a privacy tool that essentially no court can strike down. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So I said this when Samurai came out, right? So here are some of the facts as alleged by the government, and keep in mind they're allegations, right? In the case of Samurai, they said that the company, offering their service to for the coins, for the privacy, they're based, the Whirlpool, I think it is, they made profit to the tune of about $1 million or more. And that there were direct communications where they were apparently communicating with individuals, again, allegations that they were helping people try to obfuscate transactions. And apparently they were talking to an undercover FBI agent, right? Not a smart thing to do if you are, in fact, trying to build out a piece of software. But to your point, right, profiting from that activity, that is sort of a real threshold question that I think would totally change the analysis of that case. If you and again, I've asked people that are smarter than I, maybe some of your guests that come on in the future that are more tech savvy, you can ask them, like, one of my issues is, can you build those types of protocols or things like Whirlpool, can you build them without extracting a profit? Now, some people I respect have told me, no, you can't. That to build that transaction, you actually have to somehow, extract a fee or some cost for the economic transaction. At least that's the way it was explained to me. But it would be to your point, if these things just ran on autopilot, if they were truly decentralized and they couldn't be interrupted, that would be probably the best place legally to be. And by the way, that's how Bitcoin was set up, right? It was supposed to work without any one developer. This is what I think is always funny, just as an aside, in the altcoin space and crypto, they'll point to these things like Uniswap and other companies like, oh, it's a decentralized exchange. But there are like a few choke points you can go after to shut the whole thing down. Like it really isn't decentralized. I guess you could say there are decentralized aspects to it, but if there's someone you can haul into court and then the thing stops working, that's in my mind, that's like the decentralization test. If I can shut down a front end server or something and then you lose 95% of the traffic, that's not decentralized.
Right. Great points.
In this enlightening conversation, Joe Carlasare and Natalie Brunell discussed the future of Bitcoin self-custody amid potential government regulations. Joe believes that while some countries might try to restrict self-custody, such measures would likely be ruled unconstitutional in the United States. They also explored the challenges surrounding Bitcoin privacy tools, emphasizing the significant scrutiny from governments aiming to monitor transactions. Despite these hurdles, Joe remains optimistic about the preservation of liberty and freedom within the US legal system and the resilience of decentralized technologies like Bitcoin. The three main lessons from this conversation are: 1. Efforts to restrict Bitcoin self-custody in the US would likely face significant constitutional challenges. 2. Privacy tools in the Bitcoin space will continue to face rigorous scrutiny from governments concerned with transaction transparency. 3. The resilience of decentralized technologies and the US legal system offers hope for maintaining individual liberties and financial privacy. So, what do you think about this Bitcoin conversation? Do you agree with Joe and his arguments? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoy this type of content and want to see more, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, keep learning and keep stacking.